Bonjour à toutes et à tous. À titre de secrétaire général et de responsable principal EDI de HEC Montréal, c'est un plaisir pour moi de vous présenter cette table ronde organisée en collaboration avec HEC Montréal sur le thème du potentiel des marchés du carbone. Face à l'objectif commun de réduction des émissions de gaz à effet de serre, les GES, une nouvelle forme de coopération multilatérale est nécessaire pour structurer l'émergence de marchés du carbone le plus harmonisé possible. La discussion d'aujourd'hui présentera les principaux défis et opportunités actuelles pour les marchés du carbone. Il sera également question d'explorer dans quelle mesure le Québec, la Californie et l'État de New York peuvent ouvrir la voie vers l'émergence d'un unique marché du carbone nord-américain. Finalement, le panel discutera des principaux enjeux légaux et politiques associés au marché du carbone, notamment en ce qui concerne la mise en œuvre des mécanismes de compensation des émissions de GES et la conformité aux objectifs internationaux de réduction de ces émissions. Cette table ronde sera animée par mon collègue Pierre-Olivier Pineau, professeur titulaire au département de sciences de la décision à HEC Montréal et titulaire de la chaire en gestion du secteur de l'énergie. Je ne vous demanderai pas à main levée qui connaît Pierre-Olivier Pineau, car je pense qu'on le connaît tous et toutes, car c'est un excellent ambassadeur en matière de l'état de l'énergie au Québec et ailleurs. Alors, on vient tout juste d'apprendre en primeur et en exclusivité que l'essai du professeur Pineau, l'équilibre énergétique, a remporté le prix Hubert Reeves 2024. Alors, notre animateur sera accompagné par 3 spécialistes aux expertises complémentaires. Je laisserai le soin au professeur Pineau, à qui je cède la parole dès maintenant, de vous les présenter. Merci et bonne conférence.
Merci beaucoup, Johanne. Hi everyone, we'll switch to English because I think we advised our guests that it would be in English. It's really a pleasure for me to moderate this panel on carbon markets. I've been studying carbon markets for a while. I'm even an investor in carbon markets since I bought in 2014 1,000 allowances of emission rights. And I feel that it's not, the carbon markets are not well understood enough. So you just attended a panel on climate finance and how to improve the role of finance in climate. Carbon markets are designed exactly for that, to basically make sure that the financial impacts of emissions are more directly integrated into the decisions of companies and emitters. Sadly, from my perspective, there are not enough carbon markets around the world. Quebec is a leader with California because they implemented their own carbon market in 2013 under the general framework of the Western Climate Initiative. So since more than 10 years now, Quebec and California have a joint carbon market where you can buy emission rights and sell them or use them if you're an emitter to comply with the obligation of having one emission rights to cover your emissions. So companies have to disclose their emissions and they have to cover their emissions with an emission right. Just as a general introduction, it's like quotas for fishing. In the fish industry, usually, you cannot anymore fish as much as you want. You have quotas for the amount of fish you catch. If you go on and a fisherman and then you want to go fishing, you need to respect the quotas you have that are usually given by the government in many cases, and we'll go through these auctions. Governments in California, Quebec, and other regions of the world have these quotas for emissions and sell them to emitters or financial interest or traders to speculate. Or like myself, when I purchased 1,000 emission quotas, was mostly to speculate. And I purchased them at $11, and now in Canadian dollars, and now their value is $50. So in 10 years, it's multiplied by 5. So it is a good investment. So to talk about these markets today, we have a panel of 3, but we should have been a panel of 4. And so the key speaker, one of the key speaker we should have had is Andrew McKeon, and I want to mention that he cannot be with us today. He's the executive director of RGGI. RGGI is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a carbon market that was created even before the WCI. In 2009, many northeastern states of the United States decided to create a carbon market for the electricity sector, the power sector. So they were ahead of their times. They said we need to act on climate. Electricity is a key sector, emitting sector, so we need to cap emissions, and that cap has to be lowered every year. So that's a basic principle of carbon markets. You cap them, you have a number of quotas, and that number of quota is decreasing every year, creating a scarcity that brings people to reduce their emission. At least that's the key principle of carbon markets. So Andrew McKeon from RGGI was sick. He couldn't attend today. Fortunately, we have 3 exceptional speakers with us. We have John Williams, Executive Vice President for Policy and Regulatory Affairs at NYSERDA in New York. And why New York is very interesting, and we'll hear more about that, is because New York is about to create their own cap and invest market. Change the name, and we'll ask John why they used a different name. Then we'll have Ravina Advani, head of low carbon transition group from PNB Paribas Americas, and then she'll discuss with us the perspective of a bank on these carbon markets. And we have Harry Orner, strategy head at cCarbon.info. Which is a company Harry will describe in more details, but providing key information on carbon markets around the world, but mostly in North America, but we'll hear more about that. So, John, we'll start with you. And I'd like you to speak about the New York initiative. Why is New York creating a cap and invest market? And if you could say a few features about that, because we feel alone in Quebec with our cap and trade market, alone with Californians. But we're very happy to have New York joining the system.
Very good. Well, sure, happy to do that. So the New York Cap and Invest system, NYCI, Reggie's cousin Nikki, is being developed in part because of our decarbonization goals in New York State. We actually had recently completed a plan on how we would look at economy-wide emissions and looking at various different type of policy and programmatic activities to help put us on that track to really an 85% emission reduction by 2050, but also teaming that with a net carbon economy, if not in 2050, we say mid-century, close enough. We looked at a couple of different potential mechanisms to do that. We certainly did have some very successful experience with the RGGI program at the time the plan was drafted. And our council that was approving the plan based on analysis of different avenues to do that found that a cap and invest approach is actually the most economically efficient way of getting to those emissions reductions. It does provide a regulatory oversight, which certainly our environmental department was interested in maintaining and assuring that emissions would reduce over time. But certainly no other instrument like a cap and invest program is providing the ready-made resources necessary to do what we're finding is needed, which is to support the complementary activities to bring the zero emission carbon technologies to market, right? So it's wonderful to have that kind of carbon price that's established in the economy to provide a signal to the economy generally about what is necessary for the economy to start calculating and integrating into business decision making, general, even governmental decision making. But certainly not all technologies come to that carbon reduction at the same cost, at the same trajectory. So a cap and invest system has been very efficient at demonstrating that it provides those additional supports to make sure that those zero emission carbon technologies can be brought to market. So Nikki is looking at where Reggie is kind of leaving off, right? Reggie, as Pierre-Olivier had mentioned, is focused just on the electricity sector. Just power plants are obligated under that program. What we're looking to do at New York is look at all of the various other sectors and emissions producing activities and bringing them into a regime where we will have a cap on those emissions, create those allowances that can be traded, and look at how we can advance emissions reduction across that whole economy, right? So basically looking at buildings, right? We heat and cool buildings with a lot of fuel-based activities, transportation systems, certainly are going to be another, and then a number of other activities that we're still considering potentially bringing into the program, whether it's waste-based emissions, looking at industrial process. Those are very tricky emissions to get at, but really taking the most holistic view of the economy, the emissions in total in the state, and then devising a structure for how we can come up with a successful cap and invest program beyond just Reggie.
Good, nice. So I'll come back on many of the points you've raised, but first I'd like to ask Ravina, from the banking perspective and from your client, how do you see all these carbon markets developing? Because I mean, I've just mentioned the California, Quebec. Now there's the New York cap and invest market. There are other markets around the world of different types. So how do you, from your perspective, how do you see the evolution of these markets?
Yeah, I mean, we believe that, having compliance markets and voluntary carbon markets are a necessary tool in deleveraging a lot of the particularly hard to abate sectors, because technologies are not yet at the point where they're fully scalable to entirely displace fossil fuels. And so there does need to be an interim solution. We've seen SBTI actually now incorporate removal technologies as part of its strategy and guidelines on a go-forward basis for Scope 3 emissions. And so I think there's a lot more acceptance for these carbon trading schemes. We're really excited for New York's Cap and Invest program. We're active in New York. We're active in parts of Canada, including Quebec. We're active in California. And again, we just think this is another arrow in our quiver to be able to help some of these industries decarbonize. As a bank, we have trading capabilities both in the voluntary and compliance-based markets. We actually recently did a trade for one of our oil and gas companies. It was our first voluntary carbon market trade. We also recently executed an EUA carbon market transaction for a cement company. So we're actually, in addition to the litany of things that our bank is doing around ESG and decarbonization, trading some of these compliance credits is an integral part of our strategy.
Good, thank you. Harry, you are head of strategy in a firm that has the mandate of studying, forecasting carbon markets. So can you tell us a few things of your activities and how you see the evolution of your customers and the markets in general?
Sure. Thank you very much. So we really specialize in forward guidance and forecasting across carbon markets. We also look at carbon offsets, and we do clean fuels. So we're really across the whole environmental commodity space. And why are we looking at this? Well, for us, we see the market as humanity's most effective tool for organizing. And we see the largest problem that faces us is the environmental crisis. And so you need to partner the greatest tool you have on the greatest problem. And when you partner that great tool on the greatest problem, you get a very large market, and a market that's growing rapidly. So, oil is more or less at $4.5 trillion annual value globally at the moment. We've calculated all the environmental carbon markets that we focus on are more or less at around $450 billion now. However, oil and energy broadly has been the largest limiting factor of production, economic production, well, since time has gone by, but at least since the Industrial Revolution. Whereas the emergent limiting factor on our economic production now is actually the space left in our atmosphere. Energy is becoming cheaper and more available, but it's that space left to put more CO2 into. Is that it's 10 kilometers thick. It's the skin of an apple. That's what's left. That's our limiting factor in production. And so we see carbon markets as growing hugely because of that key fundamental constraint. In terms of our clients and who we offer to, so traditionally the majority of our clients have been big industrial emitters. So the BP, Shells, Chevrons of the world, cement, large emitting entities. And it's all very well them looking at the current set of carbon markets, carbon prices, and saying this is the price, this is the price. But what they really need to know is forward guidance. What's it in 2030? What's it in 2045? And therefore, what investment decisions do we have to take now to lower our carbon compliance to acceptable, to commercially viable levels by those years? And so if we can provide that early price signal through strong fundamental forecasting, which is our core role, then it helps them in decision making further down the line. So you need that current price, but you also need a load of people like us giving out strong forward prices and forecast prices, not just forward on the commodity markets, on the futures markets. So I mentioned traditionally, that's our traditional client base. One of the big transitions for us, pre-COVID, 80% of our subscriber base were those emitting entities. By the middle of 2021, it was about 40% the emitting entities. And suddenly, 45%, the majority share-ish of our customer base, were all financials. Goldman Sachs, BMO, a lot of the big financial trading houses, a lot of the banks, a load of family offices putting a load of money into these markets, seeing attractive long-term returns, a lot of family offices, and even individuals, paying for our subscriptions. Usually it's businesses, but just wealthy individuals seeing the attraction of this asset class. And so that big change in the in our own subscriber base reflected the interest in the market. In terms of the evolution of how people are treating or the attention that carbon markets are taking, we see the development of carbon markets in a few distinct phases. Firstly, and I'll take the WCI Quebec market as an example. So first you have the regulatory phase, which for us was 2013 to 2016, where it's really dead, like a tumbleweed can roll across in the market, and you've got very, very flat prices. And it's very boring to write about from our perspective. And I had to do that each week in, week out. And it was a tricky task. I even wrote poetry in some analysis because you have to get it out there. And then you see the compliance market phase, where compliance entities are waking up to this. They're realizing the price signal. They're realizing what they have to do. And you see a little bit more variation in prices. So we went from $11, $12 when the market opened up to $15, $16 with a bit of price variation. Skip forward to 2020, and we then see the investor hype phase. And that's where we typically see a massive rise in prices. The investor class come and gets involved at a significant scale. And we in the WCI and the Quebec market, these are all in US dollars, went from around $16 to within 3 months up to $35, $40. And price jumps were $1 in a day, something that I, as an analyst in 2016, only dreamed about being able to write about. And now finally we've got more rational actors in the space, where the price hype and that kind of sort of volatility has evened out a little bit in the WCI, and we now have a healthy balance of compliance entities working on their decarbonization strategies. We have investors who are coming in who are looking at fundamental prices forecasts from ours and looking to make that return on an annual basis. And we have the interplay of those two factors. And that was the transition for the WCI market. The Regi market has recently just gone through its hype phase. Prices have gone up from $12, $13 to $20 over a few months. And so we see these similar patterns. But we need to get to that maturity phase with consistent, responsive prices that are working towards fundamentals for markets to really succeed. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there. for now. But I want to get into the investment strategies and trading strategies, but maybe
we'll get to that
will be
later.
directed. You can get too excited.
But then you were talking about the different phases and how your clientele and customers are evolving. And I'd like to ask John, how do you see awareness of carbon markets and carbon pricing in New York, both on the political side and from also the population? Are they aware that it's coming up? Have you seen that rising, and are people actually asking for carbon pricing now?
Well, I would say that the population, and a lot of that is really stakeholders that have been paying a lot of attention to government policy development, really. I would say like the general population, I don't want to say are unaware necessarily. I think they are aware that New York is looking at very innovative approaches to environmental programming is perhaps the way to say it. I don't know if there's necessarily an appreciation of the economic efficiency and the way that we're trying to influence the way that we're thinking about how carbon shifts in the marketplace are really going to happen over the long term. But I do think that as long as we can demonstrate that, and which we have been able to do really quite successfully with Reggie, is that as we implement a program, that the results of the program implementation are actually tangible to most communities throughout New York State. And a lot of that really does come in making sure that the investments that we utilize the Reggie revenues for, the same would be with the Nikki revenues, is that they're actually having measurable impact in localities. That's really where the public acceptance is going to be the strongest, is making sure that the revenues that are being generated by these programs are being fit for purpose and being used for purpose. I think as long as we can keep that promise to the public, then I think the program will be successful. It allows us to then make sure that as we are assessing and evaluating the program over time, it might allow us to make some decisions to make sure that that the program is running efficiently, that the markets are running efficiently, even if it does mean that all of a sudden people are going to start hearing about a $20 price or whatever that price, I'm using that as an example, but whatever those prices may be, then there will be a growing acceptance of why the prices are at a price level, but they will also then experience what it means to have those revenues coming into the state and actually improving the quality of life in New York.
I think there's also a lot of focus just on that program and disadvantaged communities, right? As is the case with many of these programs, and also just keeping things affordable, right? I mean, I guess, a third of the revenue is going back to households and small businesses in the form of a rebate just to manage affordability in New York is something our clients are really focused on.
Maybe that's something Quebec hasn't done exactly the same way, because the revenues coming from the auctions of these emission rights are totally dissociated from the spendings in Quebec, and people know that there's a pot of money that is going for some programs, nothing for the disadvantaged, but that is very unclear in the mind of people that the money is actually coming from the auctions of the carbon markets. Harry, I think you were about to say something.
On the popular acceptance or popular understanding of carbon markets, I wanted to raise the example of Washington and the ballot initiative there. So what's happened there is there's WCI and California and Quebec within WCI, long-running partners in that market. And Washington State has recently initiated its own carbon market in America this year. And there's been a ballot initiative challenge. So on the ballot in November will be a line item more or less asking the population, should this carbon market continue operating or should it cease to exist? And right now, that's seriously contentious. That the flagship climate policy of the state is under threat under popular referendum. Now, our own polling analysis and our own assessment of historic trends and views in Washington shows that we're pretty confident it will continue on, and that voting to get rid of something that already exists is different to voting yes for a new tax. And so that's the way it's being framed. But, there's a big political debate over fuel prices. people can look over the border in California and say, wow, gas is it that? It's over here, there. Do we want to accept this program? No. And it's a huge public debate. But each of the carbon markets, as we've seen, California did its own time going through this. There are these challenges in the first 2-3 years of existence. And when the big challenges come, it sends the prices haywire. So Washington was at $65 before the ballot initiative was announced. It now sits at $30, $33, $34. The whole face of the market has changed. And we know from a fundamental aspect, it should be at 70. Yeah. So the moment, come December the 1st, if it still exists, it's going to rocket right back up to that kind of level. And so it's kind of the adolescent phase of these markets. It's got to get through those initial challenges in order to establish and to allow that consistency and regulation.
Yeah, Ravina, I wanted to ask almost the same question as John's in terms for your customers at the bank. Are they aware of these carbon markets? Do you have to push the product for them, or is it a pull? Is it the customers that are actually asking and bringing you there?
I think it depends on the client and the market we're talking about. And I think, for some of our larger customers in the oil and gas space in particular, and even in the utility space to some degree where they're managing coal assets, there is a general level of understanding of the compliance markets. There's a lot being discussed on the voluntary carbon markets and just ensuring that there's the right integrity in place and transparency in place to be able to facilitate trading. But I do think that, many of them are considering leveraging this tool, again, as a means to decarbonization. Much of what they're doing right now is actually earmarking capital expenditure towards some of these abatement technologies like carbon sequestration, like hydrogen, which will play a really important role in the voluntary carbon markets as removal technologies. Direct air capture, for example, biochar, some of those technologies are going to be increasingly more relevant as they look to employ some of these voluntary carbon market trading schemes and mechanisms.
But direct air capture, those are expensive.
Very expensive technologies. I mean, even with all of this government support that's out there, right? I mean, all eyes are on the United States with the IRA. We'll see what happens with this upcoming election. We haven't seen much by way of progress in terms of, developing and moving forward some of these technologies. There's a lot of talk. There's a lot of money being allocated to some of those projects. There's a lot of big strategic partnerships around them, but not much yet by way of actual tangible assets where there's, offtake agreements and an attractive value chain altogether to be financeable.
Yeah. Let's go back to the political situation that Harry started to describe in Washington. In Quebec, in a way, there hasn't been any kind of controversies over the carbon market. It's Jean Charest in 2012 that just said, we'll have a carbon market. People never really understood what it was, so they could never oppose it. And it was mostly hidden in the sense that, if we were asking Quebecers, do you pay a carbon price related to the cap and trade market? They would probably say, no, we don't. Or maybe we do something, but they really don't see the price because it's mostly hidden. So in a way of using the tool in the best way, making the price visible so that people can react. That's not what's happening right now in Quebec. But let's go back, John, to New York. How is the government approaching the explanation of the market? How visible will be the price? And then how do you see the political turmoil around the fact that it will? And will it really be implemented, or is it still a debate in New York?
Mm-hmm. Good questions. Well, I'll put it this way. So, Governor Hochul actually was the one that triggered NYSERDA and our colleagues at our Environmental Conservation Department to look into the development of a program. So certainly, she's weighing the cost and benefit of taking a leap into looking at something, really so significant like that. She did give us 5 criteria in order for us to look at any program as it's developing to take into consideration. as Ravina mentioned, affordability actually was the first one on Governor Hochul's list. So that has us looking at kind of the scope and the scale of the program, but also looking at other mechanisms that we can employ to demonstrate very visibly, maybe more so than the carbon price, but demonstrate the visibility that the program can take account of the cost to homeowners for that cost. So implementing a rebate option is with 1/3 of those revenues is certainly one way to get to that affordability. The other things that we're also looking at is impact to our economic development in New York State, right? What is the impact of existing businesses? But also, how do we look at Reggie, listen to me, look at Nikki and think about, what the economic opportunities to be created there are. What are the jobs in the clean energy space that we can support, and what are new jobs that are attracted to an environment that New York is looking to create. So I would say both of that, affordability and economic, are on potentially one side of an equation. How we think about the investments in terms of looking at disadvantaged communities, how we think about investments just generally in terms of emission reductions and the economic activity that can be created as a result of that are all going to be elements that are squaring into the way that we're approaching the program. So I think that, if we're able to demonstrate that we can come out of the gate with a program that meets all of those criteria, then I think from a standpoint that there's going to be a degree of acceptance with that program, I think we're feeling like we can be on good footing. I think the thing for us to, also make sure, and this was very much a case that we experienced with Reggie, that, I think the thing for us is to make sure we've got a program that's in market, that's working, and then we can understand what the revisions or the assessments of that program will be over time. Because certainly, as markets change, as the carbon market for Nikki will develop, we'll understand better about how the positioning of any such program or the positioning of that carbon price in our economy, and we'll adjust from there.
Yeah, thank you. Harry, you were mentioning, that there were phases and the market was established and going through turmoils, but do you really think there will be an end to these turmoils? Because when we look at the political situation in both the US and Canada and what could come in terms of federal elections, we don't see a very strong advocate of carbon pricing coming in the US and in Canada. So additional turmoil might be coming. But you seem to not be so.
I mean, look, the WCI went through one Trump presidency, and it can go through another one. And I'm talking about the WCI. I'm not talking about the broader political climate. I'm not talking about Article 6. I'm not talking about Paris. But I'm talking about the WCI market as a whole. It's a state-led program. There's been a lack of federal-level climate leadership, at least in the US, I'll say, for a period. Comment less on Canada, and because of that, state leadership has had to come out and replace that. And I think that the WCI market will continue well through. I mean, look, we're very nose down in the forecasting of emissions and prices on that basis. There are some interactive effects clearly around how California plugs into the US economy, how it plugs into the world economy. But fundamentally, it's state focused as we do in Quebec as well.
But it's state focused. But Ontario was part of the WCI for 1 year, and then the Ontario government, with the current premier Doug Ford, he decided no, we don't want that carbon market, and he just withdrew Ontario.
I mean that was a dark episode for the program. But I mean, the likelihood of that happening in California now is really far out, and I think Quebec is well established. So once these markets do become well established, I mean, Ontario is a market for 3 to 6 months or something, slightly more. But I mean, it felt like that given the trauma. And I think when they're established, when they come to see through, and this is not a retreating global phenomenon, something that's happening. It wasn't a fad. Quite the opposite. If we look to Europe, they've just implemented the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. For those that haven't heard about it, it's basically a way to place an equivalent amount of carbon price on imported goods, so that the theory is that so therefore European industries can compete on a level footing. That's the theory that's stated. What it's really for is to try and recoup more auction allowances for European states, because they're able to stop giving out free allowances up to the tune of 40 billion euros a year. So that's the sort of major elephant in the room on that aspect. But what the CBAM has meant is that you had, let's take a steel company in India, they were exporting steel to Europe, they would have to pay the EU under the CBAM $70 per ton of steel unit imported. But the Indian government doesn't want that 70 euros to go to Europe, it wants to keep it in-house. And so then India, and we're advising on this, we have a strong base in India, understanding we're advising the Indian government on how to set up their own compliance market. And the same is happening in 15, 20 different regions around the world, different developing nations that are not traditional carbon market home bases. And they're popping up like mushrooms right across in the world, which should be very heartening for you as a professor on this topic. But what it means is it's not a retreating phenomenon politically. It's an advancing, rapidly expanding. Now, each market has its own quirks. The program design is different. Some use more offsets. Some look to tie into Article 6.
We'll come back to these differences and harmonization potential, but I'll just want to have Ravina's views on these political issues, and do the bank sees that as a very hard difficulties, or does it prevent investments?
I think it depends on the technology. So right now, we're not seeing any abatement in capital going into the energy transition space, certainly not in the United States. I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of transaction flow, deal flow, really across all technologies, even though some are advancing more slowly than others. I do think that there is a lot of focus on the election as it relates to the EV market, for example, just because there's a lot of talk about some of those tax credits being rolled back. As we think about California, I mean, California right now has the ability to set its own emission standards. And I think that, if things pan out and there's a Trump administration, potentially those rights could be revoked from the state of California, which could have broader implications, I think, on the carbon markets in that region. But right now, I think people are just keeping a watchful eye on certain technologies. Nobody's really backing down from plans. There's a lot of, everything seems to be very polarized in the United States right now, where you've got red states, blue states. The red states continue to benefit from IRA funding. There's a lot of manufacturing going into those specific states. A lot of renewables growth is happening in the red states in particular. So a tremendous amount of deal flow, a lot of focus on what's going to happen, but nothing's really stopping at this stage.
Well, that's very nice to hear. So people, don't always understand carbon markets, because they're far from being the only markets in the environment sphere. We have renewable fuel standards in fuels. We have ZEV mandates for electric vehicles, zero emission vehicle mandates that brings different types of compliance units for manufacturers. We have renewable energy credits. Even in New York, there are RECs that you sell, and so a lot of different markets, in addition to the different carbon markets that we've been mentioning. So it won't be feasible to probably keep all of them, because the goal is always to decarbonize, and we are using these different tools. So John, let me start by asking you, why initially you said that, Nikki, the New York Cap and Invest, is in addition to Reggie. So, but why didn't you join like the WCI, which was already there? And why don't you drop some other tools that have been implemented like RECs, and then just to say, well, we have one tool and let's use that one tool?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe to start with the second half first, because I do think, that what we would call the complementary policies, to the Cap and Invest program, that until we see different technology types actually get to a level of scale where they can demonstrate that they are providing the same value and output that, a modest carbon price may may put on an equivalency with a conventional technology, that's when we're, I think, going to continuously see the need to support those technologies in the market. So that's why we have RECs. That's why we have ZEB mandates. They're not necessarily to overshadow or potentially even impact what a carbon price might be, but absent having what I might call that bottom-up movement in the marketplace is going to make a lot of pressure just on a declining cap over time without any place for anybody to really go. So I think the purpose of the complementary policies is really to make sure that we're taking specific action to get those alternatives in market that then allow for the efficiency of that carbon price to be realized a little bit more readily. The first question, get me back to that again.
Why did you choose to have
linkage?
Yeah.
So linkage actually. I didn't mention linkage was again one of the governor's kind of directions to us. I think linkage is still something that we're very interested in doing. There's a number of different program components that we're looking at with the NICI program that are really intended to facilitate linkage with larger markets. I think the thing that we're trying to do is test out like what a program design really would look like for a New York environment rather than think about it globally right off the bat. I also think that when we think about linkage, we in the East Coast, at least in the eastern states, our marketplace is a little bit different than what happens in California. Is such a standalone large market. Quebec, is a very
Washington.
Yeah. Well, Quebec is a very unique market, I think, compared to the way that we look at the fuel requirements in the Northeast United States. So linkage might be to try to attract other northeastern states to a broader regional program, very similar to what we did with RGGI. See if there's an opportunity space there. But I think we don't discount that, linkage with WCI would certainly be something we would look at in the future. So I think the real idea is that we're looking to test out for ourselves first, see what works, take on linkage as we kind of get our feet under us with the bigger NICI program.
Harry, how do you see all these different markets? Because you are in the business of selling comments and advices. So you, in a way, the more different markets, the more people are confused, and in a way, it's good business for you. Or no, again, you don't see that as. But so tell me, do you see these like multiplicity of markets as you being like something we have to go through, or do you see some potential to actually at one point converge and have one single market?
So you're broadly right. The more headaches, the more money for us is one principle. But when there are too many headaches, you then have a whole set of inaction and inactivity inertia, which is not helpful for us. So there's a healthy medium for our business. I really agree with some of your points in how a market almost needs to prove itself within its own environment, prove itself to its population, to its governing political system, and then can look at linkage from a point of success, rather than jump straight into a larger ship. I think that's really important both for the original market, but also for the future linkage partners. So again, we can move back to the example of WCI, California, and Quebec on one side with Washington. And, California has clearly stated that it wants to ensure that there's a stability and success of a carbon market with a similar level of ambition and a complementary policy design before it can then engage in linkage negotiations and linkage talks. And so I think that's a really healthy step. I just want to rewind a bit to what the benefits of linkage actually are and what are the cons, what are the pros and cons. I think from our side, the pro is that a larger market means that you're more able to find better efficiencies. Where you have some industries in one state that have far cheaper decarbonization, a larger market will allow other states to access those cheap points of decarbonization. So you have a lower carbon price for longer, which is more efficient in some sense. The cons is that you don't get equal decarbonization. The Quebec and the California example has been really interesting in this. So a couple of statistics. In 2013, the Quebec covered annual emissions was 56.7 million. And in 2022, it was 59.6 million, despite being under a carbon market for all those years. And by 2030, the individual state cap is 44 million, more or less. So not much progress being made yet, and a lot to be done in the next 6 years. But under a linked market, it doesn't really matter, because California in 2013, 350 million tons. Right now, in 2022, we're at 280, so a 70 million ton reduction. And they've got to get down to 223 million tons by 2030. And what's happened is that those reductions that should have happened in Quebec, they've happened in California, more or less. And so it's not a bad thing or a good thing. I mean, a ton is a ton is a ton. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It may have impacts for, political ambitions within state. But then coming to the Washington example, I was sat on a conference stage a month ago with Laura Watson, the program officer for Washington, and I was asking her how she expects to be able to reach her individual state targets. Because of the nature of their program design, the nature of their power sector, the various aspects of the design related to transport, means we don't believe that we think that they can reach those 2030 targets at all. They're incredibly ambitious. But she knows, by being as part of California, that she'll somewhat be taken under the larger market's wing, and that those difference in state targets will even out over the overall basis. So it presents some pretty interesting, challenging political quandaries. In the end, you get the same net tons in the atmosphere, but it can mean very different things in terms of state revenues and in terms of individual state targets. And I don't want to get any more political in Quebec than that. But yeah.
Good, thank you. Let's go back a little bit to the voluntary markets that you mentioned, Ravina, and the offsets market. Do you see a greater appetite for these for some of your customers, or do you see it's more the long-term market and that is driving them, or are they looking for some offsets compliance units that they can find?
No, I think they are. I mean, as part of COP28 this year, there was so much focus on the voluntary carbon markets and Article 6 and where we go from here. I do think that it's becoming a lot more prevalent as we're seeing some of these technologies not scale in an accelerated timeline. And so, as many of our customers think about what the best alternative is, do they set aside and spend a ton of money in CapEx to invest on their own to make that pivot internally, or do they find an interim solution? And more they're turning to some of these interim solutions where these markets are still relatively nascent. I think we'd all like a little bit more clarity and transparency into how they actually work. There's a lot of talk by the SEC and other regulatory bodies to give them that comfort to invest in these programs, but I think they're starting to recognize that you can't make that shift again overnight, right? Even if you're investing in these technologies, it's going to take time to fully scale up and prove out.
Yep. Absolutely. Harry?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually spent the cap and trade market. It's a little bit of my side hobby, or have been for the last 3 years. And really, I've spent the last 3 years building out our voluntary offsets offering within cCarbon and entirely focusing on that. And that's probably my stronger suit in a sense. And I just want to put it in context. As I said, 450 billion tons in cap and trade markets or associated markets, of which less than $2 billion of that are voluntary carbon markets. So just hold that in your head for scale. We've done an extremely extensive market forecasting work within the voluntary markets because there is so much uncertainty and noise in that space. And, most of you have heard of a carbon offset, but you may not have heard of a compliance market. They receive 90% of the attention, but they're worth $2 billion in 400 billion. So let's get them in perspective is a really important point. The current set of protocols, typically avoidance-based protocols, whether that's avoidance technology like renewable energy or waste management, or whether that's nature-based like RED+, which is avoided deforestation, or others, or cook stoves. All those protocols we forecast under the mid case, under the far more likely mid case, even in 2030 to be to reach a peak valuation of $1.5–2 billion. So not really to move from where they're at now. And under the most positive case, where the SBTI link up happens, around $7 billion annually in 2030. Whereas the removals market, we predict under the mid case to be more like 40 billion by 2030. And up to 120 billion by 2045 and beyond. Yeah. Because that's the avoidance, like where all the media attention is and all the criticism of integrity. Those are actions that will increasingly become status quo. That we expect there to be no deforestation because there are troops on the ground and indigenous property rights are there. That they're in law. All of that avoidance stuff, it will become absolutely mandatory because of the crisis that's facing us. And what we have to turn to is say, we now need to remove the carbon. And we know that removing has integrity because carbon ain't going to remove itself. Trees grow a bit, but it doesn't capture itself and store itself underground.
I have to cut you because we are coming to the end, but I first want to ask John, what's the New York perspective on offsets? Because you seem to have, like in your plans, a very different approach compared to California and Quebec with the role of offsets.
So I've done a great job avoiding really a political discussion here. So look, our Climate Act has really some very strict provisions regarding offsets as they can be designed. That was the result of a political process in New York. I do think that, until we can see the development, I think, of all of these other opportunity spaces, that the public then can feel confident that as they are sort of engaging in that kind of in-state or in-jurisdiction kind of carbon, putting that jurisdiction on a track towards carbon reduction, making their own contributions. I think there is a desire to do that. And until we can get a better sense of what the controls are over those offset opportunities, I think that that's when we'd be thinking about how we could revisit that on a going forward basis. Certainly, like if we were to look at offsets, again, our Climate Act has very strict specifications to ensure that, any of that offset activity is still inuring to those local communities, right? So which may not be the highest value for an offset market, right? So I think that's what we're sort of looking at in terms of the program right now. I think we will probably be moving forward, without looking at offsets at this point in time. But again, like we are really looking at the long term for New York for this program, and depending on how things start to evolve, that's when offsets may or may not become part of the discussion going forward.
Wow, thank you very much. I hope this discussion was helping you to understand carbon markets. Hopefully it didn't confuse you more on these different environmental markets. Thank you so much, Harry, John, and Ravina. It was wonderful to have you here to discuss your perspective on carbon markets. There will be more coming up in the future because, as you both all said, they're not going to disappear. Hopefully more states and countries join these markets. So please help me, join me to welcome, and not welcome, but thank our guests.